Kasparov, Shirov, Horgan, 1984. One of many games in which Kasparov beat GM Alexei Shirov, who, of course, was also one of the world's top players in the 1990s. You can see 2740, which by those standards was insanely high and more meaningful than it is today. So we have a Sveshnikov, which begins as a e6 Sicilian, but transposes into a Sveshnikov. Now, the Sveshnikov is an opening which has existed actually much longer than people realize. It was first played in the year 1883, which is actually quite odd when you think about it. Black weakened the d5 square. You know, in the 19th century, they were a lot less keen on violating principles of this sort. So it's actually impressive that so many players caught on to this. So we dropped the knight back to a3. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with some of the theory here. Black goes b5, and in return for the d5 square, black gets a lot of counterplay. And this counterplay comes into various types. First of all, there's a threat of b4. This knight on a3 is excommunicated. And eventually, what usually tends to happen is that after a trade occurs on f6, as you'll see, black will move the bishop away from f6, where it will appear. In fact, let's see the next couple of moves. Knight to d5, bishop e7, bishop f6, bishop f6. And one of black's ideas is to move this bishop away and then to go f5, opening up the f-file. And a lot of Sveshnikov games have been won when white gets too enamored with that square on d5 and forgets that black has very significant play on the king side, connected with this f5 move. So it's a very, very theoretical opening. White has a million different ways to play it. And Kasparov plays the main line, the most fashionable move of the time, c3. And the idea of c3 is, well, there's a couple of ideas. It controls the d4 square. Mainly, it prepares to evacuate this knight from the edge of the board with knight c2, after which white can then undermine black's pawn wedge with a4. So that's sort of a very standard set of moves. And that's exactly what happens. Shirov develops his light squared bishop. Kasparov goes knight c2. This is still very much extremely theoretical. And Shirov goes knight to b8, which is actually still remains a relatively popular move. But I think back then was the main line. And black extends the pressure on the knight on d5. The knight from c6 to b8 can then go to d7, where it at least, you know, it does a couple of things. It can later go to c5 and attack e4. It can also go to b6 and contest the knight on d5. So it's definitely a lot better placed and not in the way as the knight on c6 would be. So this move knight b8, one of those GM moves that actually is a lot more understandable than it looks. So Kasparov goes a4 as we, you know, which is the main line, undermining the pawn. Shirov has to take, and Kasparov takes with a rook. There's still over 150 games in this position. So now Kasparov was one of the first high-level games to go into this line. And it was played a couple of times previously by GMs, but not too many times. So this was relatively unexplored territory already by both players. Now Shirov, well, what to do? He goes knight d7, improving the position of his knight. And Kasparov goes rook to b4. And we are about to enter the main part of this game, the moment that made this game very, very famous. Okay, so rook b4 was played. Kasparov was the highest rated player. Was it a novelty at the time this game was played? Let me check. So it was, I don't believe a novel. Oh, chess space can be stupid sometimes. Oh god. Okay, so we see rook b4 had been played 3 times before Kasparov played it. Most prominently by Patrick Wolf, who was former US champion, now lives in San Francisco, a good friend of mine, grandmaster. He played it against an early computer, actually. So it was sort of kind of a novelty. And one very interesting thing that you guys should be aware of, at high-level chess, novelties are very big. When you manage to produce a novelty, that means you were the first person, obviously, to play a certain move. And novelties can earn you a lot of currency in terms of being considered one of the sort of leading opening theoreticians. The people who are considered opening trailblazers are those who are able to come up with new moves in previously explored positions. So there's always this sort of race to produce as many high-quality novelties as possible. Not all novelties are high quality. Some just kind of fall off the map. I believe I did thank ABF Chess. Appreciate the raid. Now, was there another raid? If so, I apologize. Now, I don't know if this is interesting to you guys. I mean, there's 2,000 people watching. I know it's late for most people, but let me know if I'm just droning on and it's not interesting. I truly mean that. I'm not fishing for compliments. Like if I'm boring you to death, please make that known. So one interesting thing is that during the 1990s, games were not readily available, right? There was no chess base, there was no mega base. And so sometimes there were moves that were called novelties, but they had been played years before in some completely unknown game between like two random 1900s. So now we can actually test whether a move is truly a novelty. But back then, everything was relative to the games that would be published in what would be called chess informants, which were compilations of top-level games that would be released as a book 4 or 5 times a year or even more. And I don't quote me on that. And everybody would buy those informants because that was the only way you could prepare for your opponents. Anyways, rook b4, not a novelty. The idea to attack the bishop. And other than Kasparov, this move was essayed by somebody named Giuliani in 2000. So I didn't know that in addition to being the mayor of New York, Giuliani was a very high-rated correspondence player. Rudolph Giuliani is a grandmaster of correspondence chess. And in 2000, while being mayor of New York, he actually also played a lot of correspondence. Just kidding. This was not Rudy Giuliani. This was a guy named Sante Giuliani, who was a very strong correspondence player. Just trolling. In any case, he also went for this line, which is a pretty big indicator that it's a pretty high-quality line. In any case, I know everybody believes me. So Shirov goes knight c5, bringing his knight, as we discussed, to a good square, and simultaneously protecting the bishop. And the novelty, I believe, amazing. And Kasparov's next move was still not a novelty. It had been played twice before by players who were not very strong, which tells me that they were correspondence players. Now, my question to you, and this is what made this game famous, what did Kasparov play? And mainly, what is the idea of this move that he played? So this is sort of the pivotal moments in the game. Yeah, King E2 is a little bit over the top. So a couple of you got it. There's a couple of recommendations which we'll go through one by one. Some of you suggested Rook B6, which makes sense in principle. Because it does, I guess, it applies pressure on the D6 pawn. And I suppose that if you take the knight, you can take with a queen. And if queen takes rook, then there's queen takes A8 check. So somehow white is holding on in this line, but I don't even think that is necessary. I think black can simply go... I mean, what can black do here? Rook b6 is... It seems very artificial to me. That's the only problem. I feel like the computer would indicate some sort of refutation here. Maybe simply bishop g5. I mean, you're not really threatening anything. So it's a little bit premature to go into this kind of play. The move is indeed rook takes b7, exchange sacrifice. And let me check, who were these guys who had played it before Kasparov? No, Kasparov was the first to play it. Kasparov was the first, in fact. I sorted it by year. No, he was not. Reggio and Alea Bairn, a 1900 played this move. And then a 2200 played this move. And then Kasparov played this move, but we don't have the actual months that these were played in. I don't know what month Kasparov's game occurred in and when those other two games in 1994 occurred. My guess would be they had to see the Kasparov game. Like, for a 1900 to come up with this and play it, possible, but that would be pretty crazy. In any case, the concept of a positional sacrifice to a lot of club players is very sort of mystical, and it might seem very foreign. And Kasparov does indeed follow up with b4. Now, I'm not going to pretend that positional sacrifices are easy to understand or they're not very hard to execute properly, but they are more understandable than some people realize. Because, so the move b4, the main idea is to restrict. The knight on b7 is completely out of the game, permanently. Not permanently, but in order to re-enter the game, it's going to have to somehow maneuver through d8, which is currently occupied by the queen, and even on e6 it's not doing much. So that knight is going to be a problem piece for a very long time. The second thing that Kasparov accomplishes is he gets control permanently of lights, and this is truly permanent, of light squares. He eliminates black's light squared bishop, so now not only is his knight unassailable on d5, but the bishop, once it comes out to, let's say, c4, is going to dominate completely on the light squares, which might not seem important right now, but it's going to be important moves down the line. That is the essence of a positional sacrifice, is you judge that whatever you're sacrificing for is going to eventually become important, perhaps more important than it appears. Now, some of you may be wondering what happens if a5, trying to undermine this pawn on b4. Well, there is no need to move this pawn. In fact, you can give a check on b5. The king has to move. Now you can drive this bishop into c6. I mean, this already looks very nasty. And then, the simplest is, I think, just to castle. And white is, you can just visually see the complete domination. Yeah, and the queen has nowhere to go either. So if you wanted to liberate this knight on b7, you could go queen d7, but you can't do that either because there's the possibility of knight b6 with a fork. So Shirov is reduced to playing on the other side of the board. He goes bishop g5, which is a very understandable move. I explained the idea of this move previously. Black is eventually trying to prepare the move f5 after castling. And here Kasparov continues to play in very inspired fashion. His next two moves are the product of identifying his worst placed piece and improving it, but improving it in a very sort of creative way. There is a piece he has that's not doing anything. And you might say, well, it's the bishop, but the bishop can be easily developed later. There is a piece that's not doing anything, and you would kind of urgently like to involve it. And that is the knight on c2. So where do we actually put that knight? Where do we lead that knight? So knight c3 allows black to take. You don't want to trade too many pieces here if you don't have to. Yeah, knight a3. And a3 is merely a transit point to c4, where the knight will park itself, applying further pressure on the d6 pawn, restricting black's position even further, and it will be sort of well defended by the bishop. And I don't think this is the only move. I think something like bishop c4 probably was also okay, but there's a lot to analyze here. I'm pretty sure that Kasparov analyzed this at home, and there's a lot of specific detail here that he factored in, which we're not concerning ourselves with right now. So Shirov castles, he goes knight c4, and Shirov goes a5, continuing to try to open the position up and get space and literally air for his pieces. Now, obviously, Kasparov does not react to that, which would be an unthinkable positional mistake. That would allow black to come to c5, which is exactly what you're trying to avoid, not to mention sort of hand the passed pawn to black. So Kasparov ignores it with bishop d3. That's a very important skill, by the way, just to ignore what your opponent is doing, not react to it. And it's also important to point out, if Shirov goes a4 and tries to bank on his passed pawn, what does white now have? And this shows the magic of Kasparov's play. When all of your pieces are activated, it's easier to employ your pieces for crucial tasks that kind of crop up all of a sudden. So what do we do? So we give a fork skis. And we pick off this pawn, or we take the rook, both of which are disastrous for black. So Shirov decides to take. Opening up the a file, at least he gets the a file. Okay, obviously we take. Now notice that the knight is still completely restricted. Shirov goes queen b8. What is the purpose of this move? Again, I've seen this game before, but it's been a long time, so it's like I'm looking at these moves for the first time as well, and I'm not well, you might say I'm a prophet, but I'm really not. I'm sort of honestly looking at it too. Now, what I think he's trying to do, is actually leave space for the knight to go to d8 and then to e6 and to d4. I agree with you. Yeah, exactly. So he's also eyeing this b4 pawn and saying, okay, if white ever moves the knight, the queen might be able to take it. Very understandable. And it may seem like things are spiraling out of control, but Kasparov senses that he needs to act with a lot of urgency. Although he has positional domination, he doesn't have forever, and that's also a very important thing to remember. If Shirov eventually gets his knight to f4 and trades the knight on d5, white's compensation could very well evaporate. So Kasparov begins to take immediate action to stir things up before Shirov is able to unwind. And he starts with the move h4, chasing the bishop away. Understandable. Bishop drops back to h6. Now Kasparov activates further the knight on c4 and jumps out to b6. Shirov responds by moving his rook to a2. And now I actually think is a very instructive moment which can be used as a lesson. A lot of players looking at this position would spend a couple of seconds and then they would play a move relatively quickly. Which move is tempting for white? Yes, knight d7. Knight d7 is very tempting because it's a fork. But that is a false hope, because after queen a7, you're actually helping black. Now, here's the point I want to make. Sometimes even if you were to win the rook, it would still not be that good. But here, you can't even take the rook because of checkmate, so you actually helped black activate his pieces. Kasparov instead plays the very measured move castles, eliminating all tactical threats. And now he's completely wiped the slate clean, and he can fully focus on using his knights and his positional superiority to his advantage. Rook d2 by Shirov. He's trying to stir things up, but now Kasparov jumps to f3, defending the bishop. You can see that Shirov's rook is annoying, but it's kind of stranded, and it's operating alone, so it's not really creating anything. And after queen a7, which Shirov plays anyway, Kasparov jumps out onto the final invasion here. Knight to d7. Look at how this knight has maneuvered from a3 to c2, then back to a3 to c4 to b6 and to d7, and at each transit point it has achieved something specific. On d7 it is attacking the rook, and if the rook moves, now we have what I think is a relatively straightforward decisive invasion of the other knight. And here, I'm pretty sure that there's probably multiple ways to win. You could fork with knight c6, but queen takes f7. Just intuitively, looks like it wins. And if you take the bishop, there is, I think, quite a beautiful crushing blow for white here. Find it. Very, very nice. I mean, this is actually kind of a typical idea if you solved a lot, but it's nice. Knight f8. It produces a pleasurable, sort of effect. Now queen g8 is unstoppable, and if you take, queen takes f8. So that's it. That would have ended the game. So Shirov desperately goes knight to d8, opening up a lifeline through to the king side. If you do the same thing now, that's actually a very clever move by Shirov, because he picks off the e7 knight with his queen, and he attacks on f8. I did get to work with Shirov for a couple of days, but I was already a GM. And he was never sort of my long-term coach. So Kasparov says, okay, no problem. He takes the rook. He has re-established material equality while keeping all of the advantages of his position, including the knight on d5, dominance over the light squares, and now a passed pawn, and a horribly weakened black's king. So Kasparov now uses the main asset that has been created, which is the passed pawn, and he pushes it. Shirov responds in this last-ditch attempt to create problems with queen a3, which he seems to succeed in doing, because if Kasparov moves the bishop, well, Shirov could take, and he could put the rook behind the passed pawn, and black may still be worse, but now the knight is actually very, very close to finally activating itself, and something like this could easily happen, and white loses most of his advantage. And this is a stage of the game in which a lot of people slip up. It's the stage where you've played a great positional game. Now you need to transition from general positional considerations to specific tactical action, and that often involves a tactical sacrifice, and a lot of people just aren't prepared for that. That was one of Kasparov's greatest strengths. I think he was able to switch seamlessly between positional play, tactical play. And he goes queen f5. he simply abandons the bishop and he banks on his incredibly strong pieces to deliver the crushing attack. And it's actually not that hard to calculate. If queen takes d3, you go queen to d7, and the king is entirely alone here. If the knight moves, well, you have check on c8, and this is just checkmate, among other ways to checkmate. There is simply no defense. If you play rook takes c3, queen d7, and now if you try to bring the queen back to a8, it's not hard to see that this is also back rank checkmate. I'm not using a computer here, so this is my own analysis. So Shurov has to move his king to e8 in order to prevent the queen from accessing d7. So now Kasparov moves his bishop away to c4, where it actively joins the attack by x-raying f7. Shurov pesters it with rook c2, and now essentially Kasparov finds not a difficult but a very elegant way to essentially end the game. He takes on h7. And we'll get to that in a second. So first, I want to ask people, what is the final sequence of moves that basically ends the game here? And in what order do you do it? Chess Kid. Got it. This is attack to queen g8 check. King d7. Knight b6. Fork, win the rook, and in a very fitting twist of irony, white sacrificed in exchange, and he ends the game and exchange up. We had a question about g6. In which position? I assume in this position. Now, was that the question, Yazezi? Was it g6 here? Oh, on f8. Okay. Yeah, so g6, I guess queen f6 was the intended response. And you're actually threatening both the knight and checkmate. So if the knight moves, you have checkmate. And you'll see that this is often the case, right? When you're this weak, every single pawn move creates more holes. So you solve one problem and you create like 5 more. So Shurov did not resign here. He moved his king, takes the rook. Now Kasparov played another nice move, rook a1. This just shows you the guy's technique. If you take the knight, he goes rook a7 check. And then he actually goes queen e8 check and picks the knight off with check, and everything falls. So Shurov goes queen d4, rook a3. Still the knight is untouchable. Bishop c1. And now a very nice move, knight e3, after which Shurov resigns. The knight completes its victory tour. If bishop takes a3, you have a fork on f5. If black prevents it with g6, the knight travels to d5. And the game is essentially over in a million different ways. Black's position collapses. And Shurov resigned after the move knight e3, move 38. I suppose if you take on e3, this is a very simple technical win. A very good choice, Coach Grant. Yeah, so that was the game, and that just shows you the seeming effortlessness with which Kasparov won tournament after tournament in the 1990s. And his opponent, I remind you, was Alexei Shurov, who at that point was probably world top 5. And if you think this was an anomaly, it was not. Kasparov won hundreds of games in this fashion, just blowing his opponent off the board with both colors. And it just appeared that all of these top GMs had no chances. It was like it was decided from the beginning. And the critical point of this game, of course, that exchange sacrifice, very forward thinking. There were no computers yet at the time. So if he did come up with this on his own, it's still impressive, because to have the foresight to realize you have enough compensation, to me, is very, very impressive. And when you look at Kasparov today, you have to realize that he retired in 2005. It's been 15 years since he played a classical game of chess. And to be thrust into a tournament with, these monsters like Magnus Sikaru, who have been literally playing for all these years and are playing more now, is incredibly taxing. And you see sparks of the old Kasparov. The problem is he's just unable to stop the blunders, which are natural, but do not forget who this guy is and who this guy was and who this guy should be what this guy should be remembered by. In any case. Well, there were controversy. That is true. There was controversy between Kasparov and Shirov, and I am not denying that Kasparov was capable of very obnoxious behavior and actions that are questionable, to put it mildly. 1,000 bits from his AZ, and that is very well known and admitted by many people. But at the same time, he was he did a lot of good things, and I have very good recollections of working with him. And he didn't do anything truly egregious, I think. So one should be charitable, given a genius of this type, I think, to sort of be somewhat understanding. But of course, that is true. I'm not denying it. And indeed, many players of great caliber have very big egos and are obnoxious indeed. Gary did plenty wrong, but nothing particularly egregious, and he played so many brilliant games. So I'm not going to go into the controversies, but he had sort of a bit of a dispute with Shirov. He said some stuff about other GMs. It was minor stuff mostly, but again, what do you expect of someone who has conquered the chess world in this regard? In any case. So, legend, absolute legend of the game, and I hope you guys enjoyed the game. I hope you guys enjoyed the analysis.